So I'm Greg. Very nice to meet you all. Currently, I'm in Miami. I'm a member of the Code for South Florida Brigade. I'm also I was one of the founding members of Code for DC, and I've worked with Code for San Francisco, Code for San Diego, or Beta NYC. I've worked around the country with various brigades. It's great to be bringing this presentation. Some of you all might have seen part of this talk before, but I want to actually dig pretty deep in this conversation. So I'm going to take up a lot of space. I'm just going to try to talk pretty quickly and still have us have some time to talk at the end. So this talk at one point was titled "Why There Isn't, Probably Won't Be, and Maybe Shouldn't Be a Yelp for Social Services," but I'm reframing it a little bit just to speak directly to your interests, which are potentially about sustainability. And I'm talking specifically about a very particular problem that showed up in the first 3 or 4 years of Code for America. And every one of its cohorts, there was a project trying to solve this problem. And as far as I can see, in every other year since, people have come at this problem and nobody's quite been able to tackle it. And I'm going to try to explain why. You all can see the slides, and somebody should be muted. Somebody, I'm hearing some feedback. If you got some background noise, let's just mute that. Thank you. So the problem, specifically, to be really simplistic for a minute, is like the safety net, which I've heard that term bandied around more and more in Code for America world. It's very difficult to see, right? It's very tough to know what resources are available to whom, how you can access those resources. This is not a solvable problem. That's the first thing I want to say. The way I want to frame this is this is a problem. This is a wicked problem. And I think the keynote addressed some of these challenges. This is not a problem that can be solved by technology. It can be made worse by technology. And if technology is used smartly, we can cope with it more effectively than we currently are coping with it. But it's not a solvable problem. And I found this myself while working for an organization that provided a lot of health and human services in the District of Columbia. Bread for the City is as good as they get when it comes to nonprofits that provide direct services to people in need. And we were a whole safety net unto ourselves: food pantry, medical clinic, legal services, social services. And on top of all that, the social workers maintained a database of 500 other organizations that we would refer people to. And over the course of about 5 years, I participated in a bunch of projects to try to take that database and build a centralized clearinghouse of community resources, all of which failed. B, I also got emails from other organizations that were building centralized clearinghouses of community resources, and they would ask me, please come up into our website and update your organization's information, and it would take me hours to do. And eventually somebody told me, you don't have to do that. And that's how I learned why this is a wicked problem. Well, just to reiterate, my slides are a little out of order. This is the scope. This is the specific kind of data that we're talking about. Which agencies, what services, where are they located, when and how are they accessed? This slide is the worst slide that I have. This explains some of the reasons why this is a wicked problem that technology will not solve. First of all, unlike Yelp, organizations provide various kinds of services in various combinations in various facilities. It's actually really complex. It's not just like Chinese food or Italian. Services have very elaborate eligibility requirements. It is not as simple as you can just walk in and be served. You have to be a very specific kind of person to access most kinds of services. And the language with which you will describe services depends on who you are and who you're describing them to. And you can have very different language to describe the same services with some validity. The way somebody will describe a service at the front desk of the service is very different from the way that the grant writer will describe it to the funder, which is different from how you describe it in one of these directories. And also, this is not like an open data project where you can simply get a government executive to say the data will be open, because these are fragmented jurisdictions that provide services, and many of them are not even provided by the government. They're entirely nonprofit. So it's not like an open data problem where we can just open sesame, wave our magic wand. And also, this information is always changing. And most importantly, I didn't even put this on the slide, the organizations that we care about when we're talking about connecting people to community resources, they don't have incentives for more people to find them. That I really want to let that sink in. Organizations that provide services to people who don't pay them for those services do not need more people coming to them. So it's basically like the way we allocate resources in this country as a society doesn't make sense, right? Like these organizations, if they get one more person coming through their door, they do not get any more dollars coming to them. Or if they do, if sometimes they get compensated for some services, but they don't get enough compensated enough to cover the cost of that service. So it's not in their interest to spend hours going to your website and updating their information, no matter how nice your website is designed. So what happens as a result of this wicked problem is there are fields of intermediary organizations that build their business around collecting this information and providing it to other organizations and to other people. There is an old field, decades and decades old. It's known as information and referral. It has a trade association known as the Alliance of Information and Referral Systems. 211s are usually nonprofit organizations. They're decentralized. Like there's 220 of them in the country, and they're all over the map in terms of their capacity and their business model. And you also have aging and disability resource centers. You have child care resource and referral centers, veterans hotlines. These are an entire sector that collects this information and usually operates phone lines and distributes it. Now we have a new emerging sector that's at this point 10 or 15 years old, and every 5 years there's a new set of startups coming to the pack, and 5 years later they've the old ones have all gone out of business and there's a new fresh crop. There's these new web startups scrape the old nonprofits' websites, package this data up, hire mechanical Turkers or international call centers to just continue making phone calls to these organizations, because that's what you need to do to have good information, is make all these phone calls. And the web-based startups are basically cannibalizing their peers' databases and packaging them up into nicer websites or nicer databases, but it's the same problem, right? It's not solving the problem. What you get is more and more sources of less and less trustworthy and less sustainable information. And when your brigade starts another resource directory project, what you're really talking about is taking this simplified diagram and making it even messier, right? So this pattern perpetuates over and over again. And the reality of the situation is user-centered design does not help us get out of this situation, because some users do need a call center. Some users do need a paper directory. And some users, like different kinds of users, are not going to benefit from the same website. So we have, this problem is uniquely ill-suited to sitting a bunch of users down and being like, what is it you need? Let me delight you with my new interface design. It doesn't work, right? We need other kinds of methods to think about this problem. Okay, so this is Open Referral's big vision. This information should be accessible through any different channel. Not your website, not their website. Everywhere someone happens to look, the information should be available. It should be like electricity, gas, or water, right? It should be infrastructure, not a commodity. This is a simplified vision of what that means, and I want to clarify, Open Referral is not a platform. This is our vision, but this infrastructure, where the same information should be accessible through many different channels, this needs to be locally appropriate, right? You need to figure out what's going to work for the given community based on their institutional landscape. And Open Referral sets out to make it easier to build this kind of infrastructure to solve this problem in a holistic, multi-stakeholder, long-term kind of way. All right. So first, the technical stuff. This is the first thing we did in the direction after we convened a community of people, and this was back in 2013, with Code for America's sponsorship. Open Referral convened a community of people who recognize that one tool will not solve this problem and we need to find new ways. That was the first thing we did. The second thing we did was start developing data specifications so that different organizations using different technologies could share the same data. Right? So the docs.openreferral.org lays out the human services data specification and the human service data API protocols, which are now standards, which I'll talk about for a little bit, and gives you basically a starting place for, if I was going to collect this data or if I was going to use somebody else's data, give me a starting point for translating this information into a technology agnostic format that can be exchanged among systems. Now, when I first laid out that vision, for many people in this community cited this comic over and over again. And I found that if you ever talk about data standards in a technical group, the larger that group is, the closer to one the odds will be that somebody brings this comic up as an effort to shut down the conversation, right? there's a weird aspect of technologist culture that has forgotten the lessons of TCP/IP and HTTP, and they only point to this comic as a reason not to do the hard work of thinking about collective action. But I want you to understand that this comic is pointing out a real but not inevitable pattern. It is not inevitable. And there's one word that you change here, and it changes the logic, and that word is competing. If you change the word competing to cooperating, if you introduce a new standard that is not trying to beat everybody else's standard, it is trying to enable cooperation across standards, then you can actually solve this collective action problem and dispel with the naysayers that are usually men. I'm sorry, dudes, but it's usually men who are trying to shut down conversations about how people can work together to solve problems. All right? So we did it, right? We developed this specification. It actually, like, it basically works, right? It's like, it doesn't solve the whole problem, but we got all these different organizations in all these different contexts to use it. And then the Alliance of Information and Referral Systems in 2018 endorsed these as standards, right? This is the trade association for the field. And we worked with them. We developed these specifications so that they would be interoperable with the trade association's tools. I went to their conferences. I held their hand. You know, I let them cry on my shoulder. It was an emotional process, but we got the old school to say, okay, yes, we will adopt open standards that anyone can use, right? So the problem's still not solved, but now we've passed the XKCD like threshold, right? We now have a standard that you can use to interact with any other standard, right? So different organizations have built different front ends, open source front ends, and like, that's great, right? There's a lot of different open source resource directories. Like the problem of building a resource directory website is solved, right? Like, I'm sure there's so much more to do. There's so much more user interface design to do, but there are basically functional, sufficient resource directory websites out there that use these protocols that you can redeploy rather than building your own. I don't actually care about them. It's nice that we have them, but they don't solve the problem, right? They don't answer the question of who's going to be maintaining the data. Okay, so this is the question. This is the work that we actually have to do. I know people want to build maps. I get it. I want there to be maps, but this is the work that we have to do. This is the first order problem, is who's going to maintain it? If it should be openly available. That is an institutional design question, right? We have to think about it. We have to figure it out. It's not volunteers. It's not the crowd. Those are not sufficient answers to the question of who's going to be responsible for maintaining this critical public information infrastructure. Okay. So I'm going to pause before I get into like the specific, because I've been talking a lot and very animated. Does anybody have any questions about everything I've laid out so far? I do want to try to get some space at the end, but give me if anybody has any, like, if you don't buy it yet, or if I went too fast on anything before I dig into some of the models that we're testing, I want to see if anybody has questions. 10 minutes. Okay, we're along for the ride. All right, we're diving farther in. Okay, here we go. There are 3 models that I'm testing. I'm not even including crowdsourcing on this list, right? I'm not saying I'm not interested in crowdsourcing. It's not a solution. It's not a solution. Volunteers are not a solution, right? Those are inputs. Those can be valuable inputs to an institutional design, but we need to design institutional solutions to this problem, and volunteers and crowdsourcing are not it. Okay, so there's 3 different models that I'm testing in various pilot projects, in various degrees of like me being responsible. Usually I'm just helping other people try things. Okay, there's the centralized open platform where one organization is responsible for maintaining information and many organizations use it. There's the data collaborative model where many organizations share information across a cooperative network. And then there's what I call the service registry model, where some sort of authority says there will be an official list of everybody we fund or credit. And it's open data infrastructure, all right? So I'm going to walk through each one of these models very quickly. I'm not time to really dig in, but the data utility model, we tested this in Miami. It's been tested in Ontario, Canada, and there's a handful of other places where one organization maintains all this information. And to give you a sense of the cost for an average metropolitan area, that's probably 2 full-time employees at least, right? And so, like, and that's not going down with technical gimcrackery, right? It's like you need bodies in rooms, right, to maintain this information, to make phone calls. And the question is, if it's going to be openly available, That's right. Nick just chatted. It's cheap if it works. 2 full-time employees is not a lot, given that this is information about the safety net, right? So the question is, but like institutions, when they're trying to sell their data, they don't get enough back from just selling the data itself, right? We have to figure out a new business model for them, because the old model of like, we have 2 full-time people maintaining this information, but if you want it, you have to pay us. Like, that doesn't work, right? And so what we're exploring this is just a hypothetical example, but models of data as a service, where the centralized utility provides the data openly for free, but the organizations that are going to build that data into their business model are not going to be able to use free. Open data doesn't work for your business model. You need a contract. You need a contract guaranteeing that the data is going to be of a certain quality, that if you have an issue with it, you can ask for a correction. You can get tech support. You can get reports and analytics, right? You can get curatorial add-ons, value adds. So I'm helping this industry through these pilot projects figure out, what can we make money on if not the data? And there are answers to that question, but they're not necessarily obvious. We have to figure it out. Yeah, I don't have enough time to unpack all this, but I would be happy to, if you have an example of an organization that you want to think through, like, what are the different business models we can walk through. And yes, we've had what we've done so far is demonstrate we've affirmed the plausibility of this hypothesis, right? I don't have a fully operational data utility business model that's like clearly going gangbusters yet. It's taking time, but like we've helped these organizations open up their database, and we've identified like, a dozen some odd organizations in any given community that might pay for services associated with it. But it's a long-term challenge. And also the data utility needs staff who's capable of actually providing a service, which they usually don't, right? So it's process change. Really quick, the data collaborative, multiple organizations, overlapping databases, they can exchange data. They don't want to give up their systems, but they can exchange updates across a cooperative network, right? And the idea is they get better quality data at lower collective effort. This is being tested in the San Francisco Bay Area. My partner is Benetech. They took 12 different resource directories in the Bay Area. They compared them. Every resource directory had like 75% overlap with the other resource directories. And everyone also had 25% that was unique to that directory. So once we got everybody in the room, they started talking to each other, and they started looking at each other's data. And all these organizations that had previously been competing with each other were like, oh, it would be valuable for us to have access to that. Or, oh, we would love to not have to maintain this. And so the question is, how do we build infrastructure that enables them to cooperate among systems? And Benetech is building a system called ServiceNet. It's open source software. It's in use in the Bay Area, where you load your resource directory into ServiceNet. It matches your resource directory with all the other resource directories in ServiceNet, shows you matching records, shows you conflicts, and you're able to correct the information and leave notes about how you're verifying that what's correct, right? And this is still like alpha software, but this is I think the problem we need to solve, right? Is how do we federate data among multiple systems that requires different humans to collaborate in ascertaining what is true? Okay, the third model I'll talk about really quickly. A register is an official list. A funder or an accrediting agency or a licensing agency can require that organizations that they fund or accredit or license update their own information in an official list, right? You can go right to the root of the problem and make it a cost of doing business, right? And the register we've already tested in several places. A government is in a good position to build a register, at least of the services the government provides and or funds and or accredits, right? So this is something you could help build for an organization that has that authority and needs this data from its own services. And the value proposition is, now that there's an open data standard, you collect this information once and every third-party system can then access it, right? It's now the open data of record, which, this builds the value proposition of a register, whereas in the past it would have just been another database. We have examples of this in New York City. New York City Mayor's Office published baseline open data. It's not like a fully complete register because it's not being like enriched or maintained, but it's like every contractor in New York City from a mayoral agency, their data is published in a standardized data set on their open data platform, right? And that's like, that could be infrastructure that third parties use to enrich that data, correct it, so on and so forth. And the way I want you all to think about, like, what do? What we try to find is local pilots, right? We try to find local pilots that can test pieces of this puzzle. And we get people together and we talk. This is how you deal with wicked problems. I know people in this community are not psyched to hear about it, but the way you deal with wicked problems is you get people together and they talk to each other, and you do it over and over again. You don't, as soon as you stop talking to each other, the problem starts getting worse, right? So this is the work. It's talking to each other. And then the technology comes way after that. If you've succeeded at the real work, then you get to build some cool technology, right? But only once you've talked to each other about who should do what and how do we test those assumptions. So, all right, I walked it through. I'm sorry I took so much time. I would love to keep chatting with you all about this stuff. I'm going to take a quick look at the questions here. And if anybody else has something that popped up. So somebody asked how to balance information that doesn't match between 2 or more organizations, right? So ServiceNet is trying to tackle that problem, right? And this is a big, hairy problem that we really could. I find a lot of technologists aren't interested in the problem of data federation. They think it's too hard. Certainly in this community, that's been my experience, is once people really think through the mess of this problem, they get to the end and they're like, you should pick an easier problem. But I still believe, I am still, like, even 10 years later, I'm still an optimist that technology can help us solve this problem, that it is possible to federate data, even though parts of this problem, like the way you describe a service, like multiple people are going to have multiple different ways of describing that service, and that's okay. We have to live in a world where that's okay. But the question is, can we get agreement on the facts, the address, the contact information, the basics, and then make it easier for different systems to have different descriptions, different subjective curation, right? If we can get agreement on the facts and have a core pool of data that multiple different systems share and present differently, then we're a lot closer towards a holistic solution to this problem. Let's see. I'd be happy to talk to, like, I insist, it is very difficult to exhaust my willingness to jump on the phone and talk with you all about this stuff. I am like, use me as a resource. All of this insight is a hard one, right? So, like, please, like, use the investment of time that I just put in 10 years of work on this, and like, help me help you all find less toxic, less unsustainable paths towards like coping with this problem in your community. All right. Sorry, I didn't facilitate a conversation. I wanted to get through the tough stuff.
No worries. Thank you so much, Greg. This was great. I definitely feel the energy and passion, and I really appreciate that. And thank you to everybody else for joining us. Remember, this is recorded, so you'll have a chance to relive this later. I'm going to be starting a new session soon, so I'll be actually ending this call. But thank you so much for coming.
I'll take some of the comments in the chat and try to address them in the notes document. All right. So hope to see you all in the notes document. Let's talk. Okay. Thank you, CC.